Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to BTC Radio Audiobook and ASMR. I'm thrilled to be your host today. Over the next few minutes, we'll embark on a journey through the airwaves, exploring diverse topics, sharing stories. So, sit back, relax, and let us be the soundtrack to your day. Stay tuned for an unforgettable experience right here. Tonight you are listening to Jews in Many Lands by Elkan Nathan Adler. Preface. The author's first visit to the East was a professional one, undertaken by instruction of the Council of the Holy Land Relief Fund. Its object was to clear up certain legal difficulties which had arisen on their estates at Jerusalem and Jaffa in consequence of the death of Sir Moses Montefiore in 1888. At that time their only buildings in Jerusalem were the Judah Turo almshouse and a windmill. The vacant land adjoining had been jumped by about 300 poor and desperate Jews who claimed that it had been originally intended for the poor, and they were poor. The journey was successful, the squatters were removed, and their place taken by industrious settlers who, through the agency of two building societies financed by the Sir Moses Montefiore Testimonial Committee, have erected some 130 decent little dwellings in place of the rude uninhabitable shanties standing there in 1888. The experience was exciting and stimulating, and encouraged the author not only to return to Palestine, but to make quite a number of other voyages to Jewish centers in the Old World as well as the New. A more or less altruistic interest in his co-religionists was stimulated by a selfish taste for collecting records of the Jewish past, which grew with opportunity. There is no sport equal to the hunt for a buried manuscript. Even an element of danger is not always lacking, and one hardly realizes how fascinating are the possibilities of a trouvaille. Given a certain amount of luck, one rises to an invincible optimism, which expects to make happy finds in the most unlikely places. And one isn't always, or even often, disappointed. A lawyer's profession gives one plenty of opportunities. Business in Spain suggests Morocco, Russia is a stepping stone to Central Asia, Egypt is but a night's journey from Palestine. And then a lawyer has healthily long vacations at least twice a year. It is quite wonderful to think how much one can do and how far one can go in 2 or 3 weeks. The modern traveler need only observe a few simple rules. If his time is limited, he should go straight to his destination and not fall out by the way. He should not observe times and seasons, nor be deterred by grandmotherly fears of hot or cold. There is much virtue in an Egyptian summer, much in a Russian one, neither is supposed to be the season, but natives live everywhere all the year round, and the traveler must be cosmopolitan. Can't lies in the churchyard, and don't is a word more honored in the breach than the observance. As for diet, too much is more dangerous than too little. The author has found continuous health depend upon plenty of green stuff and ripe fruit. Meat is quite unimportant, he has lived 4 months with only a single meat meal. But he objects to water except for external application. In the last 15 years he has managed to collect manuscripts at the rate of about 100 a year and to visit each of the continents, except Australia, half a dozen times or so. And this without any undue sacrifice of either time or money. The following sketches are notes of his journeys to Jewry, for the most part written at the time and on the spot. Almost all have appeared in the Jewish or general press. His acknowledgments are due to the editors, especially of the Jewish Chronicle and the Contemporary Review, for allowing them to reappear in a collected form. He hopes they will not prove altogether stale and uninteresting. Future travelers will perhaps not be too proud to take a hint from an old stager. Everybody ought to travel. As facilities increase, probably everybody will. And there is nothing more pleasant than finding friends in every port, unless it is making them. Even the intervals between ports are both pleasant and healthful. Nowadays communications, though rapid, are so convenient that a sea voyage is prescribed by the faculty as a rest cure. But even in the stormier past no Jew feared the sea. His commercial insight appreciated the value of the ocean highway, and he had always the gift of language, a language extra. Hebrew was, and is, a lingua franca, which unlocks the secrets of the fascinating coast and hinterland of the three great inland seas of the Old World. As for America, it is now proven that all the great discoverers, from Columbus downward, had Jews with. The following are his chief voyages: Egypt and Palestine in 1888, 1895, 1898, and 1901, Morocco in 1892, 1894, and 1900, Algiers and Tunis in 1894-5, Persia in 1896, Central Asia in 1897, Aleppo in 1898, Spain in 1892, 1894, 1900, and 1903, Russia in 1889, 1892, 1896, and 1897, North America in 1901, 1902, and twice in 1903, and South America and the West Indies in 1902-1903. Them on their travels to interpret, to cheer, and to advise. Nor did the Jews lose any time in appreciating the value of the new continent, and at last the historians of America do them the justice of admitting that they were of the first colonists and the best. It was a peculiar gratification to the author on his way back from Hispaniola to find in Spain a copy of the very nautical tables used by Columbus, which had been compiled in Portugal by one Jew, printed there by another, and presented to him by a third. The novel begins. Jews in Many Lands by Elkan Nathan Adler. To us Jews, although, as Heine would say, there are neither Madonnas there nor prima donnas, Egypt must always be of supreme interest. In Egypt we find numerous traces of our ancestors before the Exodus, and their very portraits are distinguishable on the mummy wrappings at Bulaq. In the shrunken, shriveled features of Ramesses II, we can trace the stern obstinacy of the pharaoh who knew not Joseph, just as we can picture to ourselves the tenderness of Bent Anat, the princess who rescued the infant Moses from a watery grave. King and princess both lie in the unpretentious museum on the banks of the Nile, amidst a score of other royal mummies of historical note, perhaps on the very spot where, 4,000 years ago, they were wont to come to bathe. Pithom and Ramses have been identified, and the journeyings of the children of Israel mapped out with an accuracy which after all allowance is made for the alternative routes suggested by different Egyptologists, is unequaled by any description of the march of Xenophon's famous 10,000 not half so long ago, or that of the German invasion of France, which occurred but yesterday. Solomon, Jeremiah, Philo, Sadiah, and Maimonides were all intimately associated with Egypt. The magnificence of the Alexandrian Jews is a byword in the Talmud, and the hair-splitting acumen of the Neoplatonists the admiration of modern philosophy. Nay, the cross itself, which plays so important a part in the religion of our neighbors, and which has been for us the symbol of so much oppression, can in Cairo be traced to its very unchristian origin in the world-old Nilometer, which has always, in a literal sense, been the measure of Egypt's salvation. Carrying Jews. Probably no city in the world, perhaps not even Damascus itself, and certainly not Jerusalem, can, like Cairo, boast so uninterrupted a continuity of Jewish residents, ever since the memory of man. No city, therefore, can afford so large a field of interest to one who concerns himself with Jewish antiquities. And yet, strange to say, though hundreds of our co-religionists visit Cairo, either on their passage to or from India and the colonies, or on a winter trip to Egypt for Egypt's sake, we were assured by the leaders of the community that scarcely any concerned themselves in the slightest degree about the position of the Kaironay Jews, past, present, or future. It was particularly fortunate that circumstances compelled me to spend Kippur and the earlier days of Sukkot in Cairo, for the opportunity was an excellent one to see our Egyptian co-religionists as they are. These holy days, so peculiarly calculated to excite and bring to the surface the most characteristically Jewish feelings, fall at a time of the year when the heat is so excessive that strangers dare not face it, and even resident foreigners flee from it, and it is not often that a European has the opportunity of joining the Aborigines in celebrating their feasts. I arrived in Alexandria on the eve of Kippur, so that I could make only the briefest stay there, and had hardly time to see anything besides the great synagogue, the largest in Africa, which was being made clean and trim for the service of the evening. The 10 o'clock express to Cairo by which I left, contained several Jews and Jewesses, who were hurrying back to the capital to spend the fast with their families. Some had been staying in Alexandria for business, others for the sake of the sea air. Among them I was delighted to discover a gentleman to whom I had a letter of introduction, and whose people were extremely kind to me throughout my stay. I was their guest the whole time, and their hospitality was my first and most agreeable experience of Oriental, and Jewish, characteristics. At 2 we dined that Friday, and at 5 we dined again, so that we were physically armed for the morrow. After nearly a week's abstention from animal food I found the cuisine, though strange, most tasty and palatable. Of course, we had rice and poultry, they are fasting foods all the world over, but also, we remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and olives and dates, such as can nowhere be seen in the same profusion as on the tables of Cairo. Shortly before 6, I accompanied my friends to the synagogue of Nissim Misri Bey, one of the 4 brothers who constitute the well-known banking firm of Misri Frères. Synagogue. This private synagogue, within 5 minutes' walk of Shepheard's Hotel and in the Ismailia quarter, was much nearer and therefore more convenient for me than the public shuls in the Musky, for the sun made walking almost an impossibility. It forms a sort of outhouse in the garden of the noble mansion in which the families of the 4 brothers live as a pattern united household. It is slightly smaller than the North London synagogue, and much the same in style except that bookcases filled with Hebrew volumes occupy one side, and there is no gallery. The ladies sat outside under a large awning, amongst the palm trees, quite close to the open windows, so that they could have attended to the prayers if they had wished, which they did not. Evidently the charms of conversation are as alluring in the East as they are in the West, and the tongues of Eve's daughters do not vary with their complexion. As to externals, I was most struck by the kindly thought which had provided each congregant with a fan of feathers, white or red. At first my old-world notions revolted against the use of this feminine weapon, but the flesh was weak, nay, melting, so that I, too, succumbed. My black coat, decorous garb, was another sacrifice to the proprieties which I regretted, although, after all, I may not have suffered more from the heat than did my fellow worshippers, for all that they were so lightly clad. Some wore Arab dress, but most, for it was a fashionable though strictly orthodox congregation, were in mufti, but the fez was universal. Misri himself was sometimes in European and sometimes in Oriental costume, like his house half Parisian and half African, perhaps because of his dual character as a Bey of Egypt and an Italian chevalier. The Chazan, the best in Egypt, I was told, seemed to delight his audience, but the taste for his music requires to be cultivated. His nasal twang and sing-song chant, all in the minor key, were for all the world identical with those of the mullahs in the mosques, whose calls, mingled with the barking of jackals, and screaming of hawks, and braying of donkeys, form the night cries of Cairo. We Jews always borrow from our environment, and anyone transported into a synagogue could, from the style of the decorations, affid character of the music, at once tell whether he was in a Catholic, a Protestant, or a Mohammedan country. The liturgy is that of the Italian Sephardim with some modifications, which constitute the Minhag Mizraim, such as the Dukhan every Sabbath, introduced by Maimonides. As our co-religionists there are not very learned in rabbinical lore, they are the more addicted to certain superstitions, and show a decided leaning toward the mysteries of the Kabbalah. In the Kol Nidra service this was especially noticeable. Mysteries is not the only private synagogue in Cairo. In Egypt and, indeed, throughout the Orient. It is the fashion for the leading Jews of the country to have synagogues of their own, which their friends and households attend, and which are sometimes as large as a public synagogue in Europe, while their embroideries and plate are as rich. The custom is a good old-fashioned one, and used to be as prevalent in the West as it is in the East. People who have read Professor Kaufmann's charming biography of his wife's kinsman, are Samson Wertheimer, who was Hofjud in Vienna some 200 years ago, will recollect the description of his shul, which was much such a one as that of Missouri. That of the Katois is larger and finer, and boasts of a gallery for ladies. It adjoins the magnificent residence of Moise Katoui, which was once the palace of one of Khedive Ismail's favorite pashas, and was lent by its present owner to Lord Dufferin, who lived there during the 3 months or so that he spent in Egypt as England's special commissioner. For this attention Queen Victoria sent M. Katoui her portrait, which he treasures with no little pride. The garden is almost a park, and it was a strange sight to English eyes to see some of our less devout, or more weary, co-religionists lying on the grass amid the cotton and plantain or date palms. On the west wall of the synagogue itself is a Hebrew tablet to the memory of a young son of M. Katoui, who was murdered by Arabs following on the awful night of the bombardment of Alexandria. Robbery was the motive, and his assailants chopped off a finger to get at his diamond ring. His untimely death cast a gloom not only over his immediate family, but over the whole Cairoanate community, for the Katouis are great benefactors of their brethren and surpassed by none in public spirit and intelligent liberality. Maimonides. Maimonides is, if I may say so, the patron saint of Cairo. Indeed, throughout the community he is known as WPM Awan, our Rabbi Moses the Holy. In the Oriental Quarter the chief synagogue is called after his name, and among its treasures is the N, or Bible, alleged to have been written by his own hand. In the courtyard of the synagogue is the spot where tradition says he lay buried until his body was removed to the Holy Land. This cellar-like vault is believed to be endowed with mystic virtues, so that it can heal the sick. And the efficacy of faith is so great that, to this day, patients who are brought there often recover. The Rambam's residence in Fostat, or Old Cairo, is, of course, historical. He was for years physician to the Caliph, and it is a fact that the most valuable and authentic manuscripts of his works, including the famous Yet HaHazaka of the Bodleian with his signature, of which Dr. Neubauer gives a facsimile in his magnificent catalogue, were originally purchased in Cairo. Another folio manuscript of the same work, 500 or 600 years old, beautifully illuminated, was once the property of Abarbanel, who, believing it to be in the Rambam's own handwriting, paid 3,000 ducats for it. This was recently shown me in Frankfurt by Dr. Horowitz, who is collating it, and he pointed out to me some important lections verii. It belongs to a dealer in antiquities in Frankfurt, who wants £1,000 for it. This, too, I believe, the great Spanish minister procured from Egypt, or at any rate from North Africa. Many legendary tales cluster round the Rambam's name, and form part of Cairoanate folklore. Thus the old story told by Dr. Gaster in his charming Beitrag zur vergleichenden Sagen und Märchenkund has its original habitat in Cairo. We are told that Maimonides and his pupil, or, some say, teacher, had for years been seeking for the elixir vitae. At last they succeed, and cast lots who is to be first experimented upon. The lot falls upon the colleague of Maimonides, who forthwith cuts him up, sprinkles the pieces with the wonderful elixir, and puts them in an airtight bottle, or receiver, which is not to be opened for 9 months. After that time the daring student was to emerge resuscitated and immortal. But the experimentee was the king's physician, and when weeks pass and he does not turn up, the king gets uneasy and finds out that he was last seen in company of Maimonides. Summoned to the royal presence, the Jewish philosopher is forced to confess what he has done, and the king, in a fit of indignant piety, breaks the bottle so as to prevent an immortal man from posing as a god. In another account it is not the king but Maimonides himself who, from conscientious scruples, destroys the bottle, and with it his accomplice's chance of immortality. Dr. Gaster refers to similar tales told of Virgil and of Paracelsus, and also to one in which Aristotle plays the corpus vile to the Rambam's Faust. Carides. Nowadays there are no Hebrew manuscripts of any importance to be bought in Cairo. The Karaite community possesses some interesting biblical manuscripts of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, which, though fragmentary, are in good preservation. Their Chacham, Sabbatai Manjubi, has noted the dates and descriptions of these at the end of the various books, and he seems an intelligent man. The most curious of the Karaite manuscripts is a Masoretic Bible, which purports to have been written by Moses, the son of Asher, for the congregation of the Beni Mikra, i.e., the textualists or Karaites, in Cairo in the 827th year after the destruction of the temple, i.e., 897 of the present era, about the time of Harun al-Rashid and our own Alfred the Great. The scribe's superscription runs as follows. None of these books durst they sell, for there is written on each a solemn curse on the man who should traffic in them. I heard that a few months previously many old Sephrim had been buried in the Bethlehem of the Perushim, or Orthodox Jews, at Ba'atan, but I was assured by the authorities that these comprised only ragged printed books and modern scrolls of the law, which had become puzzle, unfit for use. Sunday, the day after Kippur, I paid my first visit to the Karaite synagogue, and to my astonishment found that the congregation kept the fast on that day, and thought me a heretic for not so doing. I could not ascertain whether their calendar made Sunday the 10th of Tishri, or if they calculate by the Arab lunar year. It may have been only a coincidence, but that Sunday was the 10th day of Muharram, the first month of the Arab year and an Arab holy day, the Yom Ashtaira, on which Adam and Eve first met after their expulsion from paradise, on which Noah left the ark, and on which Hussein, Muhammad's grandson, fell at the Battle of Kerbala. In memory of his martyrdom the Shiites still cut themselves on that day, and I shall not soon forget the horrible sight the dervishes presented as they marched past the Gama el-Hassanin into the Muski, a gruesome procession dripping with blood. Before entering the Karaite synagogue, which, like a mosque, is richly carpeted, one is obliged to take off one's shoes. The worshippers stood or squatted on the carpet, there were no seats, nor any almimar in the center of the building. The Chacham, a dignified old man, and the Chazan, each had a reading desk facing the ark, and the devotion was admirable. They read the Torah from a book with points and accents, and their ritual differs entirely from that of the Sephardim, and mainly consists of quotations from the Bible. The women and girls, gaily dressed in festive attire, remained outside in the courtyard. They stood in picturesque groups which I longed to have sketched or photographed, but when I suggested sending for a photographer, I was rebuked with holy horror. The Karaites live in a separate part of the Jewish quarter, and their type, the most handsome I have come across, closely, almost indistinguishably, resembles the Arab. Perhaps the race is hybridized by intermarriage. Indeed, the other Jews look down upon them as bastards, and call them mamzerim, and will not enter their synagogue or mix with them. There are not a great many of them, perhaps 500 in all. Rabbinite Jews. The Orthodox community, which, of course, constitutes the large bulk of the Jews in Cairo, exceeds 10,000 in number, and is respectable, hardworking, and not unpopular. Most of the business is in their hands. They are the leading bankers, cigarette makers, and merchants, and, of course, dealers in Oriental manufactures and curiosities. Their stores are the finest in the bazaars, and their character for probity is certainly placed higher by travelers than that of their Muslim fellow citizens. The trade with the interior of Africa, until our policy closed the Sudan, was almost entirely Jewish, and, indeed, a member of one famous firm told me that their Khartoum agent was now chancellor to the Mahdi, whose exchequer he had replenished with some 14,000 pounds belonging to them. The Kairouanais Jews are the best linguists in the world. Besides Arabic and Hebrew, all, with the exception of the Karaites, talk the Jewish Spanish jargon, known as Ladino. The wealthier classes talk Italian in society, and have their children taught French and English. In fact, for confusion of tongues the Egyptian capital must be the modern Babel, especially the old tower on the citadel, now that it is tenanted by Tommy Atkins, who in all languages makes himself understood. I saw no black Jews, and do not believe there are any, although I was assured that numbers of white Jews can and do live up the Nile in Berber and Khartoum, and even further in the interior and nearer the equator. Practically all are Sephardim, and the prevalence of red hair is a peculiarity which may seem strange. Most of them dress in Oriental fashion and to the untutored eye are hardly distinguishable from the Moslem. They act in strict conformity with the observances of our faith, and, barring their foible for superstitions, which, like all Jews, they have borrowed from their non-Jewish and un-Jewish neighbors, are a very creditable community. Their charitable requirements are looked after by a committee of the leading members, and I understand that money is being collected to build a sort of cathedral synagogue on the European model in the Ismailia quarter. Still, their communal institutions cannot be said to be very flourishing. The hospital is somewhat primitive, but the dispensary not bad. The schools were founded in 1840 with much éclat, by Crémieux and Monk, after the triumphant return of Sir Moses Montefiore and the great French jurist from their mission to Damascus. One result of this mission was to knit the Eastern Jews to those of the West, and the visible expression of this union was the Alliance Israélite Universelle, established by Crémieux, who to this day is affectionately regarded throughout the East as its beneficent founder and Grand Master, and his portrait treasured accordingly. Victor Hugo, by the by, who survived him, had appointed him one of his executors. But, though in Egypt the Alliance found its first field of operations, the schools are not yet much to boast of, nor do they provide sufficient accommodation for the population. Till Madame Otterburg, of Paris, and her sisters visited Cairo 2 or 3 years ago, there was no Jewish teacher in the girls' school, and no Hebrew or religion was taught there. This defect has since been remedied, but, though the girls look most intelligent, the style of instruction and the school appliances are much inferior to those of other schools of the Alliance Israelite in Asia Minor, though even these err in being rather secular than Jewish. The boys' school in the Muskie is more satisfactory, the pupils clever, the masters energetic. The schoolroom seems somewhat exiguous, dark, and stuffy, in comparison with a London board school, but this may be the fault of the climate. The fierce light that beats upon Egypt and hatches the crocodile's eggs is not esteemed so highly by the natives as it is by one accustomed to a northern sun. The École Payante, or École Catholique, for boys is deserving of much praise, and it were well if we had a similar institution in London. It is a school founded by M. Catholique for the children of well-to-do parents. The instruction given is good, about that of an average private school in England. The program includes Euclid, algebra, and geography, and especially languages, Hebrew, Arabic, Italian, and English. The Hebrew is elementary, Rushi in the highest class. The boys stay till they are 14 or 15 years old, and then go into business, or in some cases are sent to Europe to complete their education. In all the schools the prevalence of ophthalmia, the curse of Cairo, strikes one as very terrible. The girls seem to suffer even more than the boys, and the headmistress assured me that a very large proportion of the pupils was always absent through diseases of the eye. Old Cairo. One of the most noteworthy of the Jewish antiquities in or near Cairo is the old Jewish burial ground of Ba'aten on the right bank of the Nile, with its flat white gravestones, which form so curious a landmark as the train passes on its way to the baths of Helouan. But even this ancient God's acre, with all its silent records of the past, must yield an interest to the synagogue in Old Cairo, or Babylon, as it was sometimes called. Among the archives of the congregation kept for safe custody in the strong room of a communal leader and banker, is a firman from some sultan or caliph. This title deed is 800 years old, or more, and purports to confirm the Jews in the ownership of the Sui Sw Noizen Ma. The synagogue is in what was formerly known as Fostat, and it is a pretty longish drive from Cairo proper. Maimonides calls it a 2 Sabbath days' journey, and it is quite 3 or 4 miles away from the Jewish quarter in the. The guidebooks say that it was once the church of St. Michael, and in style of architecture it certainly does resemble the Coptic basilicas which adjoin it. Associated with it are several curious and interesting legends about Moses, Elijah, and Ezra. It is alluded to by our Jewish Marco Polo, the great traveler Benjamin of Tudela, who visited it in 1173, and says that on that very spot Moses was supposed to have prayed that the plague of hail might cease. By the natives it is known as the Esh Shamyen, or Knesset Eliyahu. To the right and left of the center aisle, which terminates in the principal ark, are alcoves containing subsidiary arks, on the doors of which the 24th Psalm is carved in relief. This is very usual in Oriental synagogues, which, like others of the Sephardic rite, are not embellished by curtains embroidered by the fair hands of the daughters of Israel. The shape of the letters is antique, and the workmanship extremely good. High up, about 16 feet, on the right corner of the alcove to the left is a little cupboard, where they keep the scroll of the Torah which Ezra the scribe is said to have written with his own hand. Greetz has denounced this famous scroll as a sham, a fraud, a delusion, and a snare, but the natives attach, or profess to attach, great veneration to it, and have a superstition that whoever is present when it is taken out will die within the year. Dr. A. Asher suggested that, though the reluctance to show the book was too strong to be feigned, its superstitious element was only a make-believe, for he humorously attributed the objection to a fear of the true facts of the case being discovered, should the precious manuscript be seen too oft. Anyhow, I had the greatest difficulty in persuading my cicerone, who was the beadle's son, and presumably au fait with things divine, and a holy man, to let me climb a very shaky ladder and have a look at it. At last I had my way, but not without almost realizing his superstitious fears, for I was within a little of breaking my neck. The steps were rotten, and as I stood on the topmost rung I swayed, and felt like Muhammad, twixt heaven and earth. I found a door closing a small aperture, opened it, and discovered a torn and somewhat moldy sepher inside, which was evidently Pazel. The writing was easily legible and to my inexperienced eyes quite modern. I should be greatly surprised if it were found to be 300 years old. Inscription. In a corresponding alcove, on the right-hand side, I discovered a genuine antiquity, which has not, to my knowledge, been alluded to by any travelers. About 12 feet high and round 3 sides of the wall runs a single-line inscription carved in the stone, the carving good, the characters antique, and no spaces between words. It is worth while reproducing, if only because it furnishes a foil to the not less affecting, though so much more modern, inscription in the Katoi synagogue to which I have already referred. As far as I could make it out, it runs The inscription seems to be to the memory of David Solomon, who was snatched away while of tender years, the Spirit of the Lord brought him to rest. May the Lord comfort the heart of our brother, the princely Joshua, son of our rabbi and teacher, the holy Shananel, the estimable sage who rests in Eden, himself the son of our rabbi and teacher, the sage Abraham, the famous Alamsai, Alaman. The last word is evidently a surname, and perhaps the key to the whole memorial inscription. Unfortunately, the last letter, or letters, is covered, as in the 2 other cases, by boards of wood, which I could not remove. The epithet kadosh, holy, is generally applied to martyrs only. There is no date, but I should fancy it cannot well be less than 500 years old, and may possibly be considerably older. In the cloisters of one of the churches at Florence, there is a similarly sad inscription about a lost child, whose parents all mothers that saw it used to envy. The story is not an uncommon one. The loss of a promising child happens only too often, but one touch of nature makes the whole world kin. We know nothing of the cause of the little lad's death, and are free to picture to ourselves the romance of a terrible life under the Fatimite caliphs in the time of the Crusades. The whole synagogue is a gem of antiquity. Divine service is still held there regularly, but though the attendance is sparse, creature comforts have to be provided for, and it was not without a shudder that I heard that the respectable community of Cairo had resolved to have it whitewashed, cleaned, and renovated in a few months. My fears were not justified. Indeed, it was probably owing to the restoration of the building that the famous Geniza was discovered, into which it was the author's privilege to be the first European to enter, on January 3, 1896. A Jewish wedding. On the eve of Sukkot, I saw a Jewish wedding. My dragoman, Mustafa Abdurrahman, was piloting me through the bazaar of the saddlers, when suddenly the strains of weird Arab music struck upon our ears. Like all Egyptians passionately devoted to anything in the nature of a fantasia, my guide made me follow him to the source of the melody. We threaded our way through a narrow lane, the houses of which had a common gallery on the first floor, where 3 musicians were stationed. We climbed up and found a room full of people. The beadle of the Missouri synagogue was there, and from the honor shown him, I soon gathered that I was in a Jewish interior and not in a Moslem harem as I had hoped. The ceremony was just over, and the friends of the happy couple were congratulating them and taking refreshments at the same time. I, too, paid my respects to the bride, who sat beside her parents on a divan at one end of the room, while her husband lingered shyly at the other. She was young, very young, and her husband was not much older, but as to her beauty I cannot speak, for she was thickly veiled. The bridal dress of some flimsy white stuff did not seem very different from what one wears in Europe, and, indeed, the similarity of the function to the wedding at homes, which are growing so fashionable, struck me as ludicrously incongruous. The people were evidently poor, but everything was clean, and everybody was most decorous and polite. The young man was an artisan, who certainly gave evidence of considerable nous in availing himself of what was practically 3 days' holiday for his honeymoon. Tabernacle. I was struck with the number and size, nay, even elegance, of the tabernacles in the fashionable Ismailia quarter near the Ezbekai, or Hyde Park of Cairo. Of course, the Jewish quarter literally swarmed with them. One European indispensable I missed: no sukkah was provided with shutters, but then it never rains. Most were built on the flat roofs, and some in the gardens, though these are as a rule too shady for the purpose. The roof was composed of palm branches, an extravagance to my eyes, which have been accustomed to see Ethregem hanging from the roof as ornaments, but lullabim never before. However, palms are abundant in Egypt, and though I had to pay a very European price for my own ethrog and lullab, I suppose it was for the same reason that the stranger finds coals dear at Newcastle. Looking round from my entertainer's roof, I could see so many palaces with large sukkahs that I could almost imagine myself in a New Jerusalem, and feel happy, were it not for an uneasy feeling that there is a tendency, as a Jewish colleague, an advocate in the International Tribunal, wittily told me, to replace the temple by the Bourse in the place Mehemet Ali in Alexandria. Indeed, the Emperor Hadrian noticed this failing of Israel in Egypt, for, in a letter to Servianus, he says of the Alexandrians that they all really recognize one God only, the same who is worshipped by Christians, Jews, and all nations. That God is, of course, Mammon, whose very name, I am sorry to say, is Semitic. Tuesday Excipit. Of the Egypt of the Exodus I had but a glimpse as our English engine snorted through the dusty land of Goshen. We sailed across the Red Sea, and afterwards rode for a few hours on donkeys in the desert of Arabia Petrea as far as Ain Misa. This is an oasis, which some authorities, e.g., Bruges, identify as Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees. Arab traditions point to it as Mara, for the water in some of the wells there is more brackish than in others. Some is quite drinkable, and it does not require a great stretch of the imagination to attribute its comparative palatability to a miracle. Most probably, however, Ain Musa is the place where the Israelites sang the triumphal song of Moses. I devoured multitudes of dates which grew there, and blessed the spot, for they were very nice. On the way to the Suez Canal we had also passed Tel El Yedidiah, the hill, or mound, of the Jews, about 20 miles from Cairo, where Onias, the high priest, erected a temple for the Palestinian refugees who fled with him from the bigotry of Antiochus. No trace of the building remains, but Bruges discovered some Jewish antiquities there, now exhibited in the Museum of Bulak. But all these details, are they not written in the books of those wise in the wisdom of Egypt? This is end of part 1. To listen to the next part, please click on the end screen playlist or video part 2. If you like the story, do not forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. It costs nothing, it's all free. Thank you.